An emotional reunion where old enemies must decide between vengeance and forgiveness. The spring of 1872 in rural Virginia did not arrive with a sudden burst of green, but rather a slow, hesitant awakening. The war, a decade in the past, still cast long, spectral shadows over the land. The fields were replanted, the houses rebuilt, but the scars on the earth and in the hearts of its people remained. The air itself seemed to hold a memory of gunpowder and grief, a faint, persistent echo that only the old folks could truly hear. Elias Thorne, now a man of 31, walked with a slight limp, not from a war wound, but from the constant ache in his soul. He had returned to his family's dilapidated farm, a place of ghosts and broken promises. His uniform, the Union blue, had long since been packed away, replaced by homespun trousers and a faded work shirt. He tilled the soil, but his gaze often drifted to the dense woods bordering their property, the very woods where his brother, Silas, had vanished years ago, marching south under a different banner. "The creek's rising, Elias," his mother, Sarah, called from the porch, her voice thin as spun cotton. "Could be trouble for the mill downriver." Elias nodded, his eyes fixed on the winding path of Willow Creek. That creek was more than a waterway. It was a boundary, a line that had once separated his farm from the lands of the McLarens, a family whose name was synonymous with Confederate in this part of Virginia. The lingering chill of winter. The McLarens had lost everything, their sons, their property, their way of life. Elias had heard whispers that old man McLaren, once a proud and unyielding planter, was now a broken man, his fields lying fallow, his spirit as withered as the winter rye. The thought brought him no joy, only a profound weariness. The hatred that had fueled the war had, for Elias, transformed into a dull, persistent ache of sorrow. He remembered Silas's last letter, written in haste before Antietam. "Tell Mama I will be home when this foolishness is over. Tell her the stars still shine for both of us." The stars still shone, but the foolishness had cost 1,000,000 lives, and Silas never came home. He had searched the lists of dead and missing, walked the desolate fields of Maryland, but his name was never found. He was simply gone, swallowed by the war. Every spring, when the thaw came, Elias felt a renewed sense of unease. The melting snow seemed to unearth not just the roots of new grass, but old resentments. The war might be over, but the peace was fragile, a thin skin over a deep wound. An invitation in the dust. One afternoon, as Elias was mending a fence near the property line, a rider approached. It wasn't a familiar face, but a young man on a sturdy mare, dressed in plain, practical clothes, a sign of the new, struggling South. The rider dismounted, his face serious, his eyes avoiding Elias's gaze. "Mr. Thorne?" a young man asked, his voice low. "I've a message from Mr. Thomas McLaren." Elias stiffened. Thomas McLaren was the youngest son, the one who survived. He had fought at Gettysburg, a fierce Confederate cavalryman. Elias had heard stories of his bitterness, his refusal to accept the Union victory. "What is it?" Elias asked, his hand instinctively going to the small, worn hammer in his belt. The young man pulled a folded piece of parchment from his pocket. It was not an official document, but a personal invitation, written in a spidery hand. "Mr. McLaren requests your presence and that of any of your kin at the old mill by Willow Creek, this coming Saturday at sundown. He says it's time for the gathering, for all that was lost and all that remains." Elias took the parchment. The ink was faded, but the words were clear.
The gathering. It sounded less like a social call and more like a summons. He thought of the tension that still hung in the air whenever old Union and Confederate soldiers crossed paths in town. He thought of the rumors of vigilante groups, of old scores waiting to be settled. He looked at the young rider. What's his purpose in this? The young man shrugged. He didn't say, only that all families whose lands touch Willow Creek are invited, Union or otherwise. He hesitated on the last word, the old divisions still thick in the air. As the rider turned his horse and departed, leaving a faint cloud of dust on the road, Elias stood alone with the invitation. The creek murmured softly behind him, a sound that had been a lullaby in his childhood and now felt like a warning. The idea of meeting Thomas McLaren, the embodiment of everything Elias had fought against, filled him with a cold dread. Yet a flicker of something else was there too, a sliver of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this gathering might finally lay some of the ghosts to rest. The lingering burden. He walked back to the farmhouse, the parchment clutched in his hand. His mother, sensing the shift in his demeanor, looked at him with worried eyes. "Who was that, son?" Elias replied, his voice flat. "Thomas McLaren. He wants us at the creek this Saturday for a meeting." Sarah's face, already etched with the lines of grief, seemed to deepen. The McLarens, the name hung in the air like a storm cloud. Forgiveness was a heavy burden, sometimes heavier than vengeance. Elias wondered which one old Thomas McLaren had truly chosen to bring to the gathering. He wondered if he himself even knew. The days leading up to the Saturday gathering at the creek passed with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. Elias found himself seeking solace in the repetitive labor of the farm. There was a peculiar comfort in the predictable resistance of the earth. He spent his mornings clearing stones from the north pasture, the stones that the winter frost had pushed to the surface like old, unbidden memories. Clink, lift, toss, clink, lift, toss. The sound of his iron pry bar hitting the Virginia limestone was the only clock he followed. For a listener drifting toward sleep, this rhythm is the heartbeat of the story. Elias didn't think of the war in grand terms of maps or generals. He thought of it in the way the soil felt under his nicknails. This was the same soil that had swallowed the blood of his neighbors, and now it was his task to make it breathe again. The ghosts in the attic. On Thursday evening, as a soft amber light bathed the farmhouse, Elias climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The air up there was still and thick with the scent of cedar and aged paper. In the corner, sitting beneath a layer of dust, was a trunk. He opened it slowly. The hinges groaned, a dry, weary sound that echoed through the quiet house. Inside lay his Union frock coat. The blue wool was still vibrant in patches, though the brass buttons had begun to tarnish, turning a dull greenish gold. He ran his hand over the fabric. It felt heavy, not just with the weight of the wool, but with the weight of the men who didn't take theirs off. Beneath his coat was a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it to find Silas's old harmonica. He held the small instrument to the light. He remembered Silas sitting by the fire, playing "The Girl I Left Behind Me" with a mischievous glint in his eyes. Elias didn't try to play it. He simply held it, feeling the cold metal warm against his palm. He wondered if Thomas McLaren had a similar trunk in his attic. Did the enemy also sit in the dark, clutching relics of a world that had burned to the ground? The thought was unsettling. It was easier to hate a monster than a man who also possessed a dusty trunk and a broken heart. The creek's low hum. On Friday night, Elias walked down to the edge of Willow Creek. The water was high from the spring rains, rushing over the smooth river stones with a constant shushing sound. Shh, shh, shh. He sat on a fallen log, watching the reflection of the rising moon dance on the ripples. Across the water, the McLaren woods stood dark and impenetrable. Somewhere in that darkness, Thomas McLaren was likely watching the same moon. "Vengeance is a fire," his mother had told him when he first returned from the front. "It keeps you warm for a night, but it leaves you with nothing but ashes in the morning." Elias realized then that he wasn't afraid of Thomas McLaren's anger. He was afraid of his own. He was afraid that after 10 years of trying to forget, one look at a gray coat would bring the fire back. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the creek